That's so I don't forget to record.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, we still have participants joining us. Welcome, everybody. Its numbers really climbing up. Lovely. Lots of you here on this very snowy day in Toronto, whatever it's doing wherever you are. Good morning, Maria. Good morning, everybody. Okay, everybody. I see it's 11 at my clock. So we are this morning welcoming these fabulous students from Brock. They're under the guardianship of their associate director and professor. I mean, just make sure give Jessica Clark a correct identification. She's the associate professor of history. You can see Jessica up there. Give a little wave, Jessica. And she is the graduate program director. And we have 9 students in various stages of their academic history program and their graduate students, and they're going to present to you their thesis, their topic, in 5 minutes, each of them. And at the end of that 5 minutes, they'll get a 1 minute warning, and then they get a just like that, the academy when they get hooked off, that's what's going to happen to them. You will see them, and then when they're finished speaking, they will put their cameras off, and the next person will get ready. Jessica will introduce them, and at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. No matter how long this actually does go, if we have any tech hiccups, we'll come back to you, and we'll always have time for Q&A. But do start writing your questions down if you have any, and don't worry if you forget whose person it is. I'm sure we'll know from the topics. Over to you, Jess.
Thank you so much, Babs, and thanks everyone for coming. So today we have a fantastic lineup of speakers representing 3 different programs at Brock. This includes a postdoctoral fellow supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Brock's PhD program in interdisciplinary humanities, and Brock's MA in history. All these programs emphasize research excellence on really specialized and individual projects. So I'm delighted that today these fabulous early career scholars have the opportunity to tell you about their original and important research. Now, of course, the form is challenging. Many of them are writing hundreds of pages on this topic and spending years on research. So to get it down to 5 minutes is a special kind of challenge, but that's also part of the fun. So everybody, all the speakers today, have fun and enjoy yourself. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Alexandra McDonald, who's a Shirk postdoctoral fellow in history. Her nameplate will say Jess Clark, but it is Ali McDonald. And her talk today is entitled Maker's Time, Rethinking How Time Was Understood in the 18th Century. So Ali, if you want to take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so think about the first time that the last time that you made something. So for many of us, this was likely a meal of some sort. And in my case, it was a Korean stew. And if you think about how you managed all of the different ways of timing things in your meal, if it was a familiar dish, you likely never, or perhaps rarely, relied on the clock to track how the dish was progressing. So in my case, for example, I knew that the onions had cooked for long enough because they started to look a bit translucent. So then I added my pork, which I then knew was ready because I was watching the color and listening for the sear and taking a deep breath to smell how the onions were mingling with the caramelizing pork shoulder. And then when I got to that stage, I added my fermented kimchi and my pastes and broth and left it to simmer, checking occasionally. And as I tasted, I smelled, I watched, and I felt how the ingredients were changing. So in other words, as I cooked, I was taking William Ellis's advice from 1737 when the London-based brewer told his readers to, quote, regard not time, but this sign to manage the process of making, in his case, beer. So my current project historicizes the practice that I just described. And I'm arguing that people who made things in the 18th century, people I call makers, used their bodies to quite literally feel as well as smell, taste, hear, and see the passage of time in their work. So I look at a range of written and material culture sources used by women and men living in the British Atlantic world, and I think it becomes possible to argue that walk time was not absent from makers' lives in the early modern period, Clocks were only one part of a larger temporal constellation that they drew on, and in fact were often the least useful technology that people could use to properly manage any task at hand. So rather than seeing clocks as fundamentally shaping the lives of people who made things, what I'm hoping to show in my book project is that for a range of people, sensory cues, or signs, as Alice called them, were far more valuable for guiding their work than paying attention to the clock. And as a result, it was their sensory bodies that were actually the smartest sort of technologies for understanding, measuring, and feeling time as they worked. So to take one example, indigo is probably familiar to many of us. The deep blue color has dyed everything from blue jeans to cotton of transforming the green plant into the vibrant blue dye we all know. This process, which some 18th century writers described as magical or alchemical, is really actually a process of fermentation. And on British plantations in the 18th century, the highly finicky process was managed by enslaved people who observed material changes in the vat of the fermenting plants to track the process and the passage of time. Some British writers tried to find ways to force clock time onto the process, but even the most ardent writer had to admit that really the only accurate way to understand the passage of time as indigo was being produced was to watch for and track the emergence of things like changes in bubbles, scum, color, sound, and texture as the plant fermented into the blue dye. Underscoring this point, in his treatise on indigo, Richard Noland warned in the later half of the 18th century that while his readers may be tempted to try to maximize their production by having the women and men that they enslaved work through the night, this would ultimately backfire as, quote, you cannot depend with certainty upon the examination of the water, which appears blue by candlelight, but in fact is green and grainy. In other words, obscuring makers' ability to accurately read color changes and changes in the texture of the dye itself meant that you ran the risk of ruining the indigo. Time had to be managed by a full range of sensory signs, and to do that, the people physically working with the vat needed to be able to accurately draw on their embodied sensory knowledge. So while indigo is a particularly finicky dye stuff, what I'm hoping to show with my book is that in projects as diverse makerspaces across the Anglo-Atlantic world, time was simply too sensory to be understood primarily by watching the clock. If mechanical time ultimately subsumed all other ways of understanding time, it's not because it was the best, but because it provided an illusion of cohesion that could be made to appear to transcend any place-based or material or sensory realities on the ground. For people working in kitchens, brew houses, and on plantations, and in a whole range of other spaces of making, time was in fact deeply embodied, and they would have agreed wholeheartedly with William Ellis that it was far more important to regard not time, but this sign to ensure that the process was moving as they intended. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ali. Next
Thank you,
up.
Ali. Good one. Very nice. We're getting some trouble with some audio, but let's just see if it continues. This PowerPoint will stay up, will it, Jess?
Yes, it will stay up now.
Okay. Fire away. Next one. Here we go. Thanks, Ali.
Our next speaker is Lucas Koya. He is a PhD candidate in interdisciplinary humanities, and his talk today is entitled A Holy Elect, Saint Cults in Southern Italy, 1500 to 1700. Lucas, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Who are the Christian saints? Most people are probably familiar with the key figures from the religion. Jesus, Mother Mary, and the 12 disciples all bring to mind famous stories like the birth and crucifixion of Christ. Less known to a non-Catholic audience, however, are the saints, these mysterious people who have somehow given their name to countless places, including locally with the city of St. Catherine's. So who exactly are they? The word saint comes from the Latin sanctus, meaning holy or sacred. For Christians, saints are the quintessential holy people due to their special relationship and closeness to God. Generally, this closeness can be attained through two main ways. The first, martyrdom, involves voluntarily dying for the Christian faith. Most martyr saints lived in the earliest centuries of Christianity's existence. During this time, Christians of the Roman Empire experienced periodic persecution and were sometimes condemned to death in a variety of public ways. After their execution, some of these martyrs became especially venerated figures of their local community. The reasoning was that as the ultimate Christ-like sacrifice, martyrdom brought one immediately into the presence of God himself. There, martyrs would enjoy a privileged place of honor with direct access to God, and as such could intercede on behalf of the living. Hence, Christians prayed to the martyrs, asking for miracles to cure their illnesses and to stop famine, plague, and various natural disasters. A second group of saints are known as the confessors. The confessors rose to prominence with the legalization of Christianity in the 4th century. With literal martyrdoms no longer happening, these saints distinguished themselves through a form of daily martyrdom. This involves subjecting oneself to a particularly difficult life, typically through practices such as fasting, abstinence, and voluntary poverty. Such a lifestyle was believed to bring the individual especially close to God. He or she could therefore perform miracles both during their life and after their death. And for this, the confessors proved equally as popular as the martyrs. With the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Middle Ages, the veneration of both martyr and confessor saints, what is known as the cult of saints, spread rapidly across Europe. In fact, wherever Christianity went, the cult of saints went too, not as a mere minor add-on, but often as a central part of Christian worship. Anyone looking to understand Christian history then needs to account for the cult of saints. This leads to my master's thesis, which covered Southern Italian Christianity between the 12th and 14th centuries. My goal was to characterize the nature of religion at this time, using the cult of saints as a guide. To do so, I engaged with some of the dominant scholarly approaches to the issue. First, there was the question of Christianization. To what extent were the European masses truly Christian? Historians offered a range of answers, from the idea that most peasants actually retained their pre-Christian beliefs to the notion of a medieval golden age of Christianity. My research on southern Italy suggested a population that was authentically Christian from top to bottom. This became clear through the case of a local confessor, St. Peter of Morone. After Morone's death in 1296, the church performed an official investigation into his life. The goal was to determine if he should be canonized, that is, officially deemed a saint. Interestingly, the records they produced suggested that the senior church members, including the Pope himself, shared with Peter's humble devotees certain key ideas about sainthood. A saint, according to both urban bishops and rural peasants, should not only perform miracles, but must also live an exemplary Christian life. This suggested that most of the faithful had absorbed the values of the religion, which seemed to me to answer the Christianization question, at least for this time and place. But I also wanted to go beyond Christianization. I was also interested in the Christian values themselves and how they were, according to historians, changing at the end of the Middle Ages. The argument here is that as the Middle Ages became the early modern period, a new spirituality began to emerge. Where medieval Christians accessed the divine through the church, a new ethic emphasized one's direct relationship with God. This is one of the key features of Protestantism, a Christian group that broke away from the church first in Germany in 1517 and eventually spreading to England and much of Northern Europe. But it was also part of a changing Catholic sensibility, one that saw expression in the Counter-Reformation of the mid to late 1500s. My PhD dissertation then aims to investigate if and how this change touched southern Italy. I will do so through an examination of popular saint cults. What kinds of saints did people choose to venerate, and how did they interact with them? For sources, I will use canonization documents, Inquisition trial records, saintly literature, as well as art and architecture. In the end, I hope to draw attention to a tradition that valorizes humility and service to our fellow human beings. Indeed, the stories of saints remind us of the importance of empathy and selfless giving, and are therefore worth preserving and engaging in dialogue with. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucas. Well
Wonderful.
done. Right on schedule. Well done. Who's next?
Excellent. Next up, we have Elizabeth Collin-Toney. She is a PhD candidate in interdisciplinary humanities, and her talk today is called Made in His Own Image, Cosimo il Vecchio de Medici's Constructed Selfhoods.
Okay.
Elizabeth, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Florence had been a proud and functioning republic since the 12th century. In order to maintain this balance of power, officials created various positions within the Signoria, the governing body, to ensure representation from different neighborhoods and guilds. So how then, in the 15th century, did the power within the city come to be held by one leading family? Enter Cosimo il Vecchio de' Medici. He was the son of a wealthy banker, and in addition to entering the family business, Cosimo extended the Medici's authority and influence into the political and civic realms. He brought them to the fore and achieved what others failed to do. I argue that his success was due to the design and implementation of his behind-the-scenes strategy. Understanding the importance of appearance and perception, he was very intentional with the political and civic identities he created for himself and the ways he went about presenting them. To better unpack Cosimo's methods, I will be using two lenses from theater studies, performativity and theatricality. My research asks, how can these two theories shed new light on Cosimo's actions? Let me begin with theatricality. In 1434, Cosimo came back from a year-long exile with a plan to consolidate his power. He began to employ a different set of tactics to those around him in order to, one, stay ahead of them, and two, lessen their control. The obvious choice would have been to monopolize the dominant positions within the city's government, but Cosimo made sure to not occupy those front-facing roles. Instead, he chose to remain in the background. He cast the players in the Signoria by manipulating elections. This meant that his supporters constantly held the influential and significant positions within the city. Having his advocates in decision-making roles ensured that his plans were carried out on his behalf. Cosimo was therefore able to visually distance himself from official proceedings while remaining an integral political figure. He then set the scene by commissioning well-known architects and artists to complete the renovations of the San Marco convent in Florence. Michelozzo and Fra Angelico were among the artists that Cosimo employed. This demonstrated to the public that he was a devout citizen who cared about the religious well-being of the city. He wanted these public works to be completed by great artists. More significantly, he was the one to secure their talents. By investing a significant amount of money into public spaces, he also guaranteed input in what took place within them. Through these works of civic duty, he was creating a Florence that aligned with his vision and tastes. Cosimo's performativity can be understood through pieces of art that he commissioned. The first example is a bronze statue of David by Donatello. David had long been a symbol for the city of Florence, and Florentines associated themselves with this figure when they instated the Republic in the 1100s. It seems that Cosimo was celebrating the Florentine Republic with this sculpture. However, it was originally on display in the Medici Palace for visitors to see. This location in the family's residence adds another layer of meaning. Like David, the Medici had triumphed over those who tried to diminish their power. Part of Cosimo's visual politics was to interweave the imagery of Florence with that of the Medici, thus making them inseparable from one another. The fresco cycle in their family chapel illustrates the procession of the Magi, and the Medici have inserted themselves within this biblical moment. At first glance, it reveals their religious devotion and highlights their involvement in a Florentine celebration that recreates the journey of the Magi through the streets of Florence. But a closer look shows this to be another instance of Cosimo's careful self-representation. He is the figure on the brown donkey. This can be viewed as a subtle, or perhaps not so subtle, nod to Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey on Palm Sunday. This moment in the Bible reveals Jesus as the prophesied Messiah. By placing himself in the same position, Cosimo is assuming the role of the savior over the city, and the inclusion of his son beside him and his grandsons behind him visually establishes and solidifies their lineage as the unofficial rulers of Florence. The location of this image in the heart of their family home reinforces the family's aims of consolidating their power within the city without revealing their plans to the public. It was integral to Cosimo's success that he was thought of as a Florentine citizen just like everyone else. But unlike ordinary citizens, he was in control. His behind-the-scenes approach to ruling Florence is what earned him the posthumous title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. Thank you.
Thank you. Oof. Guys have done so much research. Well done. Okay, Jess, who have we got next?
Absolutely. Next up, we have Gary Gardell. Gary is in year 2 of the thesis stream of the MA in History. And again, he is logged in as Gary Gardell. He was previously Jess Clark, but he is himself now. So Gary, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Dr. Clark. Good morning, everyone. My thesis examines how lacrosse, an Indigenous game, became embedded in Canadian national identity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I explore this through a case study of St. Catharines, Ontario, a growing industrial city where lacrosse became part of everyday community life. From the 1870s into the early 20th centuries, St. Catharines was changing rapidly. Railways expanded, industry grew, and the population increased. Work and leisure were being reorganized. In this environment, organized activities such as lacrosse helped shape an emerging public life and civic identity. Lacrosse first drew sustained attention in 1873 in the St. Catharines area when Haudenosaunee teams competed for a prize at the Caledonian Games. At first, it was seen as an exhibition of Indigenous skill and tradition, but soon local residents formed their own clubs and began playing the game themselves. In 1876, civic leaders founded the St. Catharines Lacrosse Club. A year later, a team organized by a volunteer fire department, the Athletics, became the city's leading side. Lacrosse was no longer just something to watch. It was something that the community claimed as its own. In those early years, lacrosse was as social as it was competitive. Matches brought together players, spectators, and visiting teams. Bands played, supporters traveled, games were arranged informally. The emphasis was on connection as much as on victory. Railways and passenger steamships linked communities and helped spread the sport across the region. By the 1880s, the game had become more organized and institutionalized. Rules were standardized, leagues established, and dedicated grounds were built. Clubs joined governing bodies. Lacrosse came to represent order, progress, and civic pride. It reflected emerging ideas about masculinity, respectability, and modern life. The 1890s brought tension. Disputes arose over money, professionalism, and control of the leagues. Suspensions followed, and instability grew. Lacrosse was shifting from a gentleman's pastime to a more competitive enterprise. That transition altered its meaning for the community, marking the point where ideals of amateurism met the realities of intense competition. In the early 20th century, field lacrosse reached its commercial peak in St. Catharines. Large crowds filled the stands. The victories were celebrated across the city. The game became visible as a symbol of community identity. Yet the moment did not last. Professional opportunities drew players away. The First World War disrupted teams and routines, and post-war disputes slowed the revival. Youth and junior play continued, but senior lacrosse no longer held the same central place in public life. What happened in St. Catharines reflects a broader pattern. Lacrosse moved from Indigenous exhibition to local recreation, from recreation to organized competition, and from competition to a civic symbol. Under shifting social and economic pressures, it later fragmented and receded into the background. Using local newspapers, my research traces these changes on the ground, where people lived, played, and gathered. It connects lacrosse to local bonds of solidarity and shared experience, communitas. It shows how organized sport helped shape modern identities, even as it reflected unequal cultural power. In this context, inclusion often coexisted with exclusion. At its core, my thesis is about meaning, how cultural practices change as they move between communities and institutions. And St. Catherine's Lacrosse became a public forum for working through ideas about masculinity, respectability, citizenship, and belonging. Its indigenous origins gave it national symbolism, while its reorganization within settler institutions reshaped how it was played and understood. Local communities rallied to it as a way to define and represent themselves, celebrating victories as civic achievements. Our boys won again. By focusing on one city, we see something larger. National identity is not shaped by political leaders or formal institutions. It develops in everyday places through local customs and shared practices. In St. Catherine's, for a time, lacrosse did more than entertain. It united people, expressed civic pride, and became embedded in the local identity. This story shows how a game can move from exhibition to organized sport and then become part of how a community imagined itself: ambitious, disciplined, and modern. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Well, rather pertinent in this day of video of Milan Olympics. Interesting. Okay, who have we got next? We're halfway through and everyone's going right on schedule. They're keeping into their 5-minute limit beautifully.
Yes, absolutely. So next up, we have Owen McAllister. Owen is also in the second year of the thesis stream of the MA in History, and his talk today is entitled A War of Words, Jacobitism as a Language of Dissent in England during the reign of William III, 1688 to 1702. Take it away.
Hi, and thank you very much, Professor Clark. My research focuses on printers and authors who utilized Jacobitism to speak out against the reign of William III in England. Similarly, it also examines censorship and the ways in which the regime attempted to silence its detractors. The Jacobite movement emerged from the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, when William of Orange usurped the throne of his uncle and father-in-law, James II of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The common narrative is that the Glorious Revolution was a bloodless, popular revolution that reflected the will of the people of England. In contrast to Scotland and Ireland, there was no violent rising in England. However, the use of language related to Jacobitism to criticize the regime of William was widespread throughout England. Those who supported or had links to the Jacobite movement were diverse in opinions and political aspirations. In turn, my research is focused on a wide section of English society, covering Anglicans, nonconformists, Roman Catholics, even so-called Whiggish Jacobites, and more generally, those involved in the print trade. Within London, Jacobite printers formed a network to publish the works of all dissenting voices across the nation. The production of Jacobite works carried with it the potential of being charged not with the print acts, but with high treason. And one Jacobite printer, William Anderton, was executed. Although others would be sentenced to death, they would typically become informants to save their lives. To counter the proliferation of Jacobite texts circulating in England, William's regime utilized the legal system to punish the transgressors and detractors of the regime. An example of this is the unfortunate case of John Pendergrass. John had read a short pamphlet called A Short History of the Convention to 3 patrons at a pub. The text was written from an Anglican perspective. It was critical of heretics such as William of Orange, who was a Calvinist, and attacked the idea of elective monarchy. It also criticized the supporters of William as popish and claimed he was advised by priests, oddly enough. It called for the restoration of James II by Protestants with Protestant measures. This just happened to be the first text the first Jacobite text that the Williamite regime would make a concerted effort to suppress. A royal proclamation was produced calling for the apprehension of the author and printer of the work, with the promise of a reward, an ever more common incentive during the reign of William III. Subsequently, John was turned in by the owner of the pub, who had witnessed his out loud reading of the pamphlet. John, unable to say who the printer or author of the pamphlet was, in turn was held responsible for writing, composing, and publishing of it. Unfortunately for John, he was both Catholic and Irish. The Lord Justice explained that none but a papist would have spoken such words, and John was a notorious Irish papist. Worse yet, John is said to have conducted himself in court like a person inspired with the true spirit of popery. He was pilloried twice and fined £100. Unable to pay the fine, he was stuck in Newgate prison for a year. During his imprisonment, it came to light through a government informant that John had in fact not written this work, but this did not change John's situation, and he would only be freed by a petition to William III for the remittance of his fine. In all likelihood, it was Charlwood Lawton who had really written this work. Lawton was one of those odd Whiggish Jacobites, hence hating Catholicism but also wanting to restore James II. This saga shows that the perceived enemies of the state and actual Jacobites were not easily distinguishable. Both the contemporary and historical narratives fail to reveal the complexity behind Jacobitism. In turn, my research reveals that detractors of the state utilized Jacobite language to criticize the new regime, and that in this messy environment, the state created a culture of informing and used the law to punish and silence its perceived enemies, both real and imagined. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. Lots of new stuff
Wonderful.
there. Well done. While we're halfway through, I'm just going to remind everyone that should you want to donate to our cause here at the Niagara Lake Museum, I've just posted the link. And just a reminder that we are in a campaign to the end of February where we're matching dollar for dollar with Miller Waste, and we're looking at matching right up to, we can raise 150,000 if you care to, join the matching campaign. So please take a look at that, and you can find it on our website and join us in the rise to make our museum bigger and better. Okay, over to you, Jess. Who's next?
Thanks, Babs. Next up, we have Emma Crabe. Emma is a year 1 thesis stream student in the MA in history. And today she will be talking about her project, Tensions of Telling, Women's Early Holocaust Testimony. Take it away, Emma.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. I appreciate that. So today I am just introducing everyone to the central figure of my thesis. So you can see her here on the screen, and her name is Miriam Novich. She's a Polish-born Jew who in the 1930s, her graduate studies takes her to Paris. So she's in France as it's invaded and occupied by the Nazis and the Vichy regime is set up. So during this time, she pretends to be Christian and actually joins La Résistance to fight against fascism. She's arrested by the Germans in 1943 as a political partisan. So her Jewish identity is not originally found out. And she's placed in Vettel camp, which is on the border of Alsace and Lorraine. And the Vettel camp is interesting. It's a camp of exchange. It's very different from other concentration camps within the Nazi system. Here, she meets a Yiddish poet named Itzhak Katzelson, who urges her to keep his memory through both his testimony and his poetry. And he, in 1944, is deported from Vettel to Auschwitz. After this interaction, she starts to record vast testimony of both men and women. By this point, her Jewish identity is well known, and it entrusts her with her documentation work. So it's important to note that this is 1944, and it is pre-liberation, which is why her being in Vettel camp is very important, as it's a camp that would not have been under the same sense of occupation as others. As of January 22nd, 1945, she is granted the task of completing the documentation of Jewish Holocaust experiences officially from the Federation of Jewish Organizations in France. So she continues in Vettel until March 1945, after which she's moved to Babul, which is towards the center of France, and in April, where she is in a displaced persons camp. So here, once again, it's pre-end of war. However, the Allies have regained control in France. She continues in the East with her documentation work in Poland, and then later in Israel in the early 1950s after she migrates. Little is written about her early French work, which is interesting considering she continues to publish primarily in French until the 1980s. She would pass in 1990. So, for some context of what she's doing, as of 1944, the end of the year, documentation efforts in various camps and localities had started. So, the most notable of this that may be known is the Riggelbaum Archive, which was a secret archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is taken under control of documentation efforts in Poland. So as liberation continues, as Jews are placed in their own displaced persons camps and health concerns are met, cultural revival through documentation advances, and it ends in formalized institutions, which are known as Jewish historical commissions. In France, there would be the Contemporary Documentation Center, which still operates today. However, Miriam was never officially a member of this institution. There's also another famous one in Poland, which is now called the Jewish Historical Institute, once again, still active, but she was not in direct liaison with these institutions. However, she was in contact with a number of key figures. This remains important because she is shaping the documentation landscape, and she is a woman. In these institutions, it was very rare that women would be at the helm of documentation efforts. They may be involved in low levels, but typically what would happen is that men would design documentation structures, particularly questionnaires, which would then be given to men to go interview women, which would then be written down by men. So there's a lot of gender lenses, which are these testimonies are put through. So through analyzing Marian Novich's work, we can see the differences between a testimony that is given by a woman to a man versus a testimony given by a woman to a woman independently recorded. A lot of the translators used by Marian were also women. So this is a very female space compared to the traditionally male space. And we can look to see how this influences traditional ideas of women of the Holocaust or within the Holocaust who are traditionally either painted as victims of sexual abuse or as resistance fighters. So we can see if there's a more of a middle ground there or how this shades those interpretations. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful, Emma. Thank you.
Well done. Yes. Okay. And who is our seventh presenter?
Our next speaker is Ethan Monsian. Ethan is also in the first year of the thesis stream of the MA in History. And his talk today, excuse me, my timer. His talk today is entitled Provincial Provisioning, the Diet and Food Supplies of the Provincial Marine. Take it away, Ethan.
Thanks so much, everyone. All right, apologies in advance if this hits a little too close to home. Picture this, everybody. You are tasked with defending Canada from the invading Americans. What would be top on your priority list? Probably like defensible fortifications, weapons, combat training for personnel, probably stuff like that, right? What about food? Food is not often what leaps to mind first when we think of traditional approaches to historical conflicts, but there's a reason for the saying that an army travels on its stomach. What do we need for any mobilization in any time period? Food. And yet the logistics of provisioning shift with time and place. Provisioning within the unique environment of the Great Lakes Basin is exactly the task that people in Canada faced during the War of 1812, and what I am examining is the role of a little-known naval unit called the Provincial Marine. Throughout this conflict, war of attrition tactics reigned supreme and rained down terror on the populations as both Americans and British Canadians raided and fell victim to raids of supplies, weapons, and most importantly, for my line of inquiry, provisions or food. The War of 1812 is not often explored as a genocidal war, but it really was when you think of the American policy towards the citizens of the indigenous nations of the continental interior. The Americans were expanding into their lands, massacring villages. This was one of the major causes of the war. They viewed them as savages, standing in the way of white American progress, and the American military used attrition tactics such as burning crops, looting houses, against these indigenous nations and against their British Canadian allies. Most of the indigenous nations allied themselves with the British Canadians because at that particular time, the British Canadians were much less aggressively expansionist than the Americans. American General William Hull, commanding the early invasion, issued a proclamation, for instance, saying that if an allied indigenous and British Canadian force dared to resist his invasion, this will be a war of extermination. The first stroke with the tomahawk will be the signal for one indiscriminate scene of desolation. And that is one thing I think is not well known about this war, just how high the stakes were. Then, as the invasion of Canada wears on, the Niagara Peninsula, one of the major battlegrounds of the war, is also an agricultural powerhouse. You need to get these massive amounts of food around the province quickly. How do you keep people fed in these circumstances? Well, the waterways are the highways of the day. Enter the Provincial Marine. These guys were a small, unique, and often maligned Canadian task force created during the 7 Years' War, 6 decades before, for two purposes: fighting on the lakes and transporting troops and stores. They were sort of a separate navy for the inland waterways of North America, and especially the Great Lakes or inland seas. If an army travels on its stomach, so does a navy, and the garrisons needed not just stores of weapons, but also of food. During the 7 Years' War and American Revolution, the Provincial Marine had served as the main naval force on the inland waterways. In peacetime, they kind of just become a transport service for the military, and by the outbreak of the War of 1812, the military high command was like, all right, guys, time to turn it on. Elbows up! And the Provincial Marine was like, oh, guys, our guns haven't fired in like 25 years. Come on. What do you want from us? And so it was that you have Reverend John Strawn saying mean things like, our Navy is worse than nothing. Fair enough, Reverend Strawn. The Provincial Marine had the opportunity to press their advantage of greater numbers and organization in the early days of the war, and they blew it. They failed to gain the upper hand on the Great Lakes and didn't really mount a serious military opposition until the Royal Navy came to back them up in May of 1813. But remember, fighting was not their only job. Keeping the military supplied was equally their task, and while they did not gain control of the lakes in the early days of the war, here's the thing, neither did the Americans. So what I'm looking at is the Provincial Marines' provisioning efforts on the high inland seas, keeping those supply lines open and going during the war. To stay supplied, you need two things: the supplies themselves and the ability to transport them. The Provincial Marine were both transporting provisions themselves, and they were keeping the Americans from gaining mastery of Lake Ontario and cutting off that supply line. So they were at the Battle of Detroit, for instance, where Tecumseh and Brock took the fort with barely any bloodshed, keeping the communications open and the supplies coming across that river. So therefore, I'm paying attention not just to the food itself, but to the guns that guarded it and the waterways it traveled on too. Something academics call foodways, or how people procure food, prepare it, and then what it means to them. So to borrow an appropriate expression from the great historian Natalie Zeman Davis, what harvest do I hope to yield here? I think the significance of this study is to explore how people feed themselves in a war of attrition, a context tragically all too well known to many people right now. Essentially, I wish to explore this question: how did the Provincial Marines' provisioning efforts function during the war, and what significance did their efforts have to the people whose lives they touched? Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ethan, for an animated presentation. Exciting and very local. Thank you. Who's next?
Next up, we have Mitchell Woodard. Mitchell is also a year one thesis candidate in the MA in history. And today, Mitchell will be speaking about his thesis, Circulating Knowledge and Ideas During the American Enlightenment, John Beale Bordley's Essay and Notes on Husbandry and Rural Affairs. Take it away, Mitchell.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. How do you know? That is one of the most fundamental questions that anyone can ask a historian regarding their work. Whose voices are prioritized, what types of sources guide your thinking, and ultimately, what evidence do you have to support your argument? But as historians, it is a question that we quickly learn might also be put to the people we study. It is also a question that historians of the American Enlightenment, the intellectual and philosophical movement that developed many of the ideals which led to American independence, have pondered in a concerted way since the mid-20th century. How did early Americans during the American Enlightenment know? Was the American Enlightenment simply about importing and realizing distinctly European ideas? Or did early Americans themselves contribute to the Enlightenment? Were they part of the intellectual networks and foundations of their country? Right now is a time when interpretations and rethinking of American values are increasingly impacting Canada and the world. It thus proves worthwhile to revisit those origins, the origins of those values, and rethink how they came to be in the first place. My research contributes to these historical conversations through a case study of the work of one particular figure of the American Enlightenment, early American judge, planter, and agriculturalist John Beale Bordley. Now, John Beale Bordley might strike you as an odd example of an early American case study, likely because you've never heard of him. His name is not immediately familiar, like Benjamin Franklin's, nor is his name on the title of a Broadway musical, like Alexander Hamilton's. Yet, as I have been learning in the early stages of this project, Bordley, like many of his contemporaries, was intensely dedicated to the development of America and to the ideals of the Enlightenment. This was most notably the case for improvement, both in himself and the community around him. For example, in her biography of her father, Elizabeth Bordley Gibson recounted an episode when a neighbor copied a design of Bordley's creation from his farm on Y Island, Maryland. She recalled that he simply dismissed the action, affirming, quote, "There is room enough in the world for him and me, and many more such." But also, like many of those around him, Bordley would not simply express his experiments or thoughts on a local level. He took them to print, combining his observations with the most relevant literature of the times, all to promote the spirit of improvement to all those around him. In his waning health, wanting to continue that passion, he collected many of his life's writings in a single work, Essay and Notes on Husbandry and Rural Affairs, originally published in 1799 with a second, revised edition following in 1801. My research analyzes Essay and Notes and pays close attention to Bordley's sources of information. This allows me to further answer that earlier question and reconstruct how an enlightened American knew in the world that he lived in. Early observations during this process have revealed three things. First, a large volume of sources and subsequently ideas did, in fact, originate from Europe. This includes printed works from notable centers such as London and Edinburgh, and personal correspondence with Europeans on tour in America. Second, a seemingly equal number of sources originated in America. These include printed works and personal exchanges with people of all sorts, though they are all well supported by personal observations and experiments made by Bordley himself. Third, many of the sources, while written by Europeans and Americans, contain observations and arguments that are geographically rooted in neither Europe nor America. These include observations on customs found in Asia, most notably China, and the Middle East, including Syria and Egypt. While there is still much work to be done with my Bordley case study, I do have preliminary answers to the question of how did early Americans during the American Enlightenment know? They suggest that the fuller answer is not found exclusively in America or Europe, but rather has its roots in global pursuits of knowledge. In a sense, an enlightened American could seemingly know from anywhere, so long as it was relevant to their pursuits. Thank you.
Well done, Mitchell. Okay. Well done, everybody. We have one more to go. And who's bringing up the rear?
Last but not least, we have Graham Anderson. So Graham is also in year one of the thesis stream in the MA in history. And today he'll be talking about his project, Martial Masculinity, the Sword and Gender in Late Medieval Germany. Take it away, Graham.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clark. In 1444, the humanist and future Pope Pius II, Aeneas Silvio do Piccolomini, wrote about his journey through the fractious towns and cities of Germany. What impressed him most was not the beer or the sausages, but rather the abundance of weaponry. He wrote, quote, "Not only every noble, but even every burgher in the guild has an armory in his house." The skill of the citizens in the use of weaponry is extraordinary. This martial obsession sprung out of a need for defense against both local rivals and foreign invasion, but it also created strong bonds of both community and identity, uniting all men of the town as citizen soldiers sworn to defend their homes. Many historians have written about the mixed effectiveness of these civic militias in battle, as well as its role as a unifying force within the community. I will build on these works and show how sword ownership was more than just a legally mandated defense measure. It was also a deeply personal, political, and symbolic display of a person's civic pride and their masculinity. One way to understand the importance of bearing arms is not to look at the sheer abundance of weapons within towns, but instead how the community reacted to their absence. The prime example of the unarmed man in the medieval world is the priest, so let us take him as an example. Legislation from 16th century Augsburg lists people who are banned by law from being on the streets during an emergency: women, children, foreigners, and the clergy. Whether due to perceived weakness or unreliability, all of these groups were consciously excluded as unfit to join the townsmen in protection of the city, be it from fire or foreign attack. The emasculation of the priest was not simply a legal construct either. It also bore social and literary significance. Despite a supposedly privileged position in society, the priest's inability to bear arms, combined with sexual abstinence, led many of their peers in the laity to see them not as role models for good Christian men, instead more as a third, allegorically feminized gender, held apart from the real manly men of the town. There was an additional class of man banned from bearing arms: those who had committed an offense against the community. In 1546, for instance, authorities stripped an officer of Blaubeuren of his sword for a year as punishment for striking a man who had already fallen. 5 years later, in 1551, officials banned a peasant from Haberschlacht from carrying any weapon other than a knife with a broken tip because he broke an oath. While part of this was certainly an early attempt at weapon control, disarming those men who were allegedly dishonorable or a danger to society, it was just as much about the humiliation, physically stripping the wrongdoer of their pride and identity. For those men who were allowed to bear arms, the sword was much more than a symbolic display of masculine power. It was also a community bonding tool. For instance, most cities had a Bruderschaft, an informal brotherhood for citizens to learn the art of sword fighting from professional fencing masters. This was first and foremost a community organization. Both the members of the brotherhood and the masters were almost always common citizens of the town. In other words, they were artisans and guild members rather than nobles. With this city full of armed men taking pride in their fighting abilities, it's unsurprising, perhaps, that swordplay was not confined to within the Bruderschaft. Duels and brawls were both relatively common occurrences. However, both fencing manuals and criminal records suggest that these duels were mostly performative and seldom lethal or even particularly harmful. The 16th century fencing master, Joachim Meyer, said to strike with anything but the flat of your blade was unbecoming of a man or a German. We can also remember our officer from Blaubeuren, stripped of his sword for striking a fallen man. With this in mind, perhaps the best way to think of the Bruderschaft is not as an institution centered around violence, as people have done in the past, but as a site of competitive male bonding, the medieval beer league, if you will. In my research, which will draw on civic and criminal records, personal inventories, town chronicles, fencing manuals, and various artistic sources, I aim to show that the bearing of arms in Germany in the late medieval and early modern period was more than practicality and defense. Instead, the sword was a symbol of manhood and masculine pride. Men went through great pains to acquire stores of arms and teach themselves and each other how to wield them. Those who were deemed unsuitable to carry a sword were feminized, humiliated, and ostracized from their peers. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Whew, deep breath. So much work has gone into all of that, Dr. Clark. So much work.
Absolutely. And everyone did such a great job keeping to time. As I said, they've got hundreds of pages and years of work, and they have condensed it so nicely.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for throwing your comments in. You know, like there's everybody know there's people have been saying, Kristen's been very great, giving you enthusiasm all the way through. So, would you like to throw a couple of questions at them, or shall I throw out a couple just, moving through? I mean, I suppose we've got time here. I mean, I'd go right back to Ali, I guess, ask the first one. Go back and say to Ali, what did you find when your research, Ali, with looking at 18th century time and understanding, what did you find? What was the most surprising aspect for you that you find for people then, how they acknowledge time?
Yeah, so I had initially gone in. So the 18th century is sort of famous for thinking about, clocks and watches are proliferating, and there's more and more sort of mechanical time coming into people's lives. So when I started my research, I thought, I'll find a lot of that. And then given the people that I'm interested in, actually, there's really not that much at all. It's not absent, but so much of what people are talking about is like measures by teacups or measures by scum or measures by scent. And so really, it's kind of like how many of us still cook or still make any number of things. Time is so much about how you feel it and understand it rather than how you would like mechanically measure it. So I think I really thought I would find this like, scientific measuring. And in fact, I found much more embodied sensory stuff.
As opposed to now, like we are run by time. We are so controlled by time, it seems.
Yeah, yeah, and it was interesting because in some ways I feel like we're super controlled by time, and yet every time I make anything, I always think about like how it looks, how it smells, how it tastes, how it touches. So it's kind of this like duality we live in, right?
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Lucas, jump in, Dr. Clark, if you have anything. But Lucas, did they all have to die to become a saint?
Yeah, definitely not. So in the earliest centuries, majority of saints who we have were martyrs. But as mentioned, when Christianity was legalized in the early 300s in the Roman Empire, martyrdoms were no longer happening. So instead, you see this kind of rise now of these confessor saints who, instead of dying, they kind of reinterpreted the concept of martyrdom. And instead, we're saying, well, they're kind of dying every day. It's like a form of daily martyrdom through a very austere way of life. So fasting, not eating for extended periods, sleeping on very hard surfaces, very much intentionally. So these confessors are now rising to prominence, as well as people like monks and the monkish lifestyle and nuns who are also now becoming saints very prominently from the 300s onwards.
Okay, good. Elizabeth, when even reading about Leonardo da Vinci and that, how did they get their money? How did they save? How were they not being robbed all the time? How did the Medicis get their money? Where did it come from?
So their money came from their banking industry. They were one of the wealthier families that ran a bank, and they had numerous important clients. They were bankers to the popes for quite some time. So that was how they amassed their wealth, and it was held in maybe more of a secure place than some other people would have had access to.
Want to jump in with a question from Linda to Lucas. She says that I think you said that St. Catherine's was named after a real saint. She said she was led to believe that it was named after Robert Hamilton's wife, accounting for the spelling. Do you have any background on that?
Unfortunately, I do not. All I know is that so St. Catherine's is St. Catherine's, but I do know that St. Catherine of Alexandria, who is a real saint who is venerated, is the patron saint of St. Catherine's, and therefore we have the cathedral in St. Catherine's that is was built in the honor of St. Catherine of Alexandria. So whether or not the name, was based off of the life of someone or St. Catherine of Alexandria, definitely the city now has as its patron a real saint.
Thank you. Yeah. And just one quick question back to Elizabeth. What do you think their branding was all about with the Medicis?
That's a nice way to put it. I like that. Their branding. I think especially with Cosimo and the earlier members of the family, it was really important that everyone thought that they were just another citizen. They weren't calling themselves rulers. They weren't calling themselves princes. They held all the power and all the influence, but it wasn't openly acknowledged. And I think kind of having that little bit of a gray area was very important to their branding, that it wasn't what they were doing wasn't obvious, was very important.
Okay, nice. Book recommendation, if everyone can see that or not, from Maria to Lucas, although not about a martyr, St. Francis of Assisi by G.K. Chesterton, famous G.K. Chesterton. He authored the Father Brown series books, now BBC TV drama. Thank you, Maria, for that. Okay, moving on. Owen, the language of dissent. I found this particularly interesting, the coded language of dissent. I mean, how did they share the coded language? How did the average person know what was being said to them through the coded language?
Yeah. So the language itself isn't like overly secretive. But it's basically not from the people you would typically expect to be Jacobites. So it would feature in works by like Charles Lawton or Robert Ferguson, who were like hardline Whigs. But they would criticize elective monarchy. They would criticize the overthrowing of a legitimate monarch. So people would realize immediately kind of what they're talking about, but it was just come from people that you would never expect. And I think that's kind of the most kind of exciting thing about kind of the Jacobite movement is that we have an idea of what Jacobites are, but in reality, it's kind of like very widespread throughout English society.
Yeah, totally. Okay. Um, Anybody want to jump in there? Everyone is there. Jess, you want to get in there? I don't want to dominate here, but I'll just keep going if you like. Emma, um, such a sensitive subject, isn't it? What did those narratives miss? What did those
Uh,
early testimonies reveal that the earlier narratives missed?
Yeah, so a lot of work done on the Holocaust up until fairly recently in the 2010s doesn't really use a ton of a lot of the early sources from those historical commissions from, say, Marianovich, because there's a lack of understanding of how they were created, right? Historians like to very much understand the process that goes into source creation. So looking at, say, the stuff from the 70s and 80s, a lot of the stuff that's venerated by the Holocaust Memorial Museum, a lot of that stuff is used along with some very famous source sets that don't look at a lot of these kind of one-offs from this displaced persons camp, etc. So there's a general sense that a lot of stories are kind of missing, right? There's also bias within any Holocaust work, right? We can only tell the stories of those who lived. So when we think about that, we need to focus on
I've lost her.
work is there's a lot of obscurity, both in her own telling of her testimony. She never gives her full testimony. She only gives a partial one in the 80s. But in reading the words of women, there's a lot of information they don't tell. It's very kind of functional, right? It's not emotional. It's very like third person. So I think interpreting them as either like really strong resistance fighters, although there definitely were women in that boat, or as fairly highly emotional victims, or like ideas of overcoming ideas of sexual abuse that then leads to resistance fighting. I think there's a lot of gray area there that we can work with, and we should work with as historians of the Holocaust.
And I'm sure you will. Okay, Ethan. Love your presentation, Ethan. So animated. I think you've really you're nailing it. So, what drew you to this subject, Ethan?
Well, that's a really good question. Thank you. Essentially, this is going to sound funny, but it was sort of almost a bit of a cheat on my part on not specializing too much with my. It sounds funny, especially because seems like a very niche thing, but I had a trouble narrowing it down what I wanted to study for my master's thesis because I have really broad interest in history. I like a lot of different things, and one of the things I really loved about this was the fact that it combined so many of my interests. Yeah, I had a hard time kind of like choosing what I wanted to specialize in for my master's thesis because you have to specialize. But this combined food history, which is deeply personal, but it's also universal. It kind of connects us all throughout, you know, geography and culture today, but also throughout time. But the thing is, historians talk about things being historically contingent or changing with time and changing depending upon the cultural context and what food means to people and how they procure it, how they prepare it, how it gets to them. That will change depending upon the historical context as well. So that's what I kind of was talking about there with foodways. And so because that can like then incorporate, so many different things into it, whether it's religion, like, Lucas especially focuses on that food has a huge amount to do with people's religious understandings in the past, especially around, communion and around, the kind of materiality of belief in that. And a lot of people in the military at this time would have been deeply religious. So I'm hoping to look at that. I'm hoping to look at, some other things in terms of the commensality that was implied by, or kind of, the sense of community by sharing meals on board ships and, in the military and that. Like when a sailor died during the war, for instance, they would say he lost the number of his mess, meaning the number of his place at the dinner table where they would all eat and share a meal together on board the ship in the galley. And I think that really implies a lot about like just how much kind of sharing a meal meant to people in the time period and kind of what that meant to these sailors. So it just combines so many different aspects of things. I'd heard about just simply the French Marine through great professor of maritime history and underwater archaeology, Dr. Kimberly Monk at Brock University.
Yeah.
He taught me about them first. And then
Food,
that's,
absolutely.
it
And we
combines so
tend
many
to
different things.
forget how important food is. Absolutely. Absolutely, we do. Food security. Okay, over to Gary on the lacrosse history in St. Catherine's. So, did you play any time, by the way, Gary? Have you ever played?
I played a little bit of minor lacrosse. I'm a retiree, so my lacrosse experience goes back a long, long time ago.
Hmm.
Yeah, I did play a little bit, but not. I was, I came to the game rather late and I left it rather early, but I enjoyed the brief time I spent with it.
In those early years and before the turn of the century, how many teams would there have been forming any kind of league?
Yeah, there was a league that was based in Montreal, and non-Indigenous lacrosse really originated with elites and upper middle class people in Montreal, and that league flourished and included teams from Toronto. Toronto was always getting in their organization was always getting into conflicts with Montreal, and they started a league in Ontario, and they called it the Canadian Lacrosse
Hmm.
Association. Really, it was just Ontario teams, and it was in a lot of it was in a lot of middle-sized cities. Probably the high point came, as I mentioned early 20th century, and 1905 stands out in local lacrosse when St. Catharines won the Ontario Championship. The league included three teams from Toronto, a team from Brantford, and I think perhaps Orangeville at that time. So it really kind of blossomed in 2005, but there was always disputes between clubs and leagues, and it kind of fell apart before World War One really started up.
Fascinating history and surprising we don't have it as an Olympic sport. And now we feel
It
that
will be.
hockey, it will
Yeah,
be?
the next Summer Olympics, when that
Ah,
happens in LA, they're going to reintroduce lacrosse, and it's going to be kind of a hybrid version between field lacrosse, which is popular in US universities, and what we call box
well,
lacrosse in Canada. It's going to kind of blend the two together, and there's a lot of countries that play lacrosse to this day, but really it's an American, a native game still, and a Canadian game that really excel at the sport.
okay, brilliant. Okay. Um, Mitchell, how did John Beale Dudley, how did he know? You talked a lot about agricultural documents that were then. How did you find out all that research? That's a lot of digging around. Where did they show up from?
So that's actually a really good question. This is kind of the period of time where they're starting to play around with like actually putting like footnotes in their work and like citing sources, but in ways that are very unnatural to us.
Mhm.
So like a lot of the sources that he's citing, there actually is references in there that are very oftentimes very vague, but there's like just enough kind of contextual clues to pull out, okay, here's a last name. We've got someone's last name and we've got kind of an abbreviated version of a source. So it just kind of goes from, okay, well, you know, who is this person? And then what sources did they write? And then you can kind of deduce from there, this is the source that's being referenced to. And then it's just a matter of like making sure the page numbers and line up and all of that. But
Mhm.
it's fortunate that again, this is kind of when they're just starting to really invest time and thought into doing that kind of stuff. So they do leave a paper trail in a sense that's
Oh,
adequate enough to find the sources.
I can only imagine the rabbit hole he had to go down for that. I'll get to Judy's question in a second, but I think we're just down to Graham. Graham, I was reminded of the Three Musketeers when you were talking. And when you said that the flat of the sword was all they needed to do to, prove their manliness, and the Three Musketeers, can you tie it back to Dumas in any kind of way? Have you read the Three Musketeers?
This is kind of embarrassing for someone in my field of study, but
Uh-oh.
despite dressing up as D'Artagnan, I was like 8 for Halloween. I've never actually read The Three Musketeers, which so um this- yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I could speak to that more, but that might be something for further inquiry. So
Well, yes, and they
our
certainly.
modern our modern understanding of how they how or I guess 19th century understanding of how they viewed their sidearms.
Well, they're full of everybody would have a duel at the drop of a handkerchief, right? So,
Oh, absolutely. Mhm.
and many duels ended
There's
in, like as you said, not necessarily in death, just in gentlemanly acknowledgement, which is,
yeah.
we can't really imagine what that would be like now. That you would just say the wrong word and they'd throw a handkerchief down, and then you've got a duel on your hands. So,
Uh,
that to me was the most interesting part of how prominent that was in that world that described. Have you ever lifted a sword yourself?
yes, I actually, if you see on the wall behind me,
Uh,
that's a small sword from I think 1903 up there. It was my great uncle's.
oh,
Um,
fabulous.
and I
Really?
have a couple other swords lying around the apartment in various odd places.
Okay. Have I got through everybody? Have I missed anybody? Got everybody. Judy asked about who did that. Who was that wonderful triptych she asked about? There was a triptych, one of their graphics, some lovely graphics, by the way. But what did the triptych portray? What triptych would that have been, I wonder? I don't remember. Maybe Dr. Clark could fill us in. You're on mute, Jess. Yeah.
Yes, I believe that we're referring to Lucas's presentation, perhaps.
Maybe.
Let me see if I'll pull it up. We'll see here. Let's
Is
see.
that it, Judy?
There. Is that the
That would
triptych?
be the triptych. Yeah. I'm not
Yes.
sure.
So that there is a Spanish depiction of all saints. So it's depicting all of the saints, quote unquote, in heaven with God and Jesus. And I believe that it dates to, I believe it was early 1400s, that one from Spain.
Okay. Honestly, these guys, I'll say and bring back Dr. Clark here to do a closing statement for everybody, but it was fascinating. The research is amazing. As we were saying in our marketing of this, it's history in the making. You are all doing this. You're presenting history. It's new thoughts, new research, and it's infinitely interesting. Thank you so much. Jess, would you like to do a closing comment?
Yes, I want to thank everyone for coming out and for supporting everyone, all of these researchers. Everyone's doing incredible work, and this is such a nice opportunity to share this with the community. And most of the presentations had email addresses on their slides, so please feel free to reach out to the researchers if you have any questions, ideas, sources, or opportunities. And if you missed any of those, please feel free to get in touch with Babs, and I will help arrange a connection between the two of you, because we'd be really interested to hear what you think about all these research projects. An excellent job, everyone. Really, really fantastic work.
Elizabeth would like to talk to Ali about her work when she's in the department. Lovely work, she says, everyone. And I'd like to remind everyone, again, thank you, everyone, for your incredible commitment to this, that next week is our last in our virtual series, our virtual lecture series, and we have historian Dr. Kerry Abel, and she's going to be talking about the life and times of Elizabeth Simcoe. And it's based on her book, A Life in the Age of Revolution. And it's really traces the impressive journey of a woman whose private life intersected with so much of public change here, especially in Upper Canada, as wife to John Graves Simcoe. As we know, all of you know, the impact he had on Upper Canada and the settler community, and then ultimately in anti-slavery. So she draws on rich archival sources in her book, and it brings Elizabeth's world to life. So we'll explore that next week and hope we'll see you all then. And thank you, everybody. It was really, really great. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.